So I'm Oliver Wise. I'm with Socrata. I'm really excited to moderate this panel. We have two really brilliant, very entrepreneurial people up here to talk about the latest and greatest of how they're using data to help address blight in their communities. So to my left here is Laura Settlemyer. Laura is the first ever director of blight policy in Hartford. She's a lawyer by training. She trained under Frank Alexander.
That's right, yes.
Yes, in Emory Law School, who's probably the leading legal thinker on blight in the country. Then we worked together in the city of New Orleans. And then she went on to Detroit and Flint with the Center for Community Progress and is now running the show at Hartford and is doing an awesome job of that. And then to her left is Leah Tammy, who's also trained as a lawyer. And she's the Chief Performance Officer for the city of Cincinnati. And I think it's amazing what has been accomplished in such a short period of time since your office, the Office of Performance and Data Analytics, has been around, I think, just since 2015, right? And they really stood up a remarkably robust and holistic system there. They do a great job, I think, not just in sharing open data, but really telling the story around it. And I'm really excited to have them both here. So without further ado, Laura, just can you tell us, how are you using data to help address blight in your community?
Sure. So I would say using data is one of 5 key things that we are doing to fight blight in the city of Hartford. The 5-piece formula is a dedicated team, community input, data, new blight ordinance, and a land bank. And I won't get into the policy stuff here, but let's talk about data, and especially using data in conjunction with community input. So looking at the numbers, looking at the map, looking at property conditions, and also talking to residents, talking to community leaders to confirm that the data that we are seeing and using is what they are also seeing and experiencing on the ground. So what we have up on the screen is we've got 2 maps of the city of Hartford. One on your left is from 2017. We did this the winter of 2016, 2017. We did this when we first created the blight remediation team, and I can't stress how important it is to start collecting data as soon as you can when you start a project, even if it's not perfect, which neither one of these maps is perfect. The maps, to credit our GIS team, the maps themselves are great, but the work we did, we only have 4 inspectors for the entire city, and we only had 2 inspectors in the winter of 2017 to do the whole city. So we know not every blighted vacant property is on either one of these maps, but to get a baseline and to start with a baseline so that then in year 2, which is the map you see on the right, in 2018, we can see that there has been a reduction in some of the blighted and vacant properties. The difference between the 2 maps is 100 properties. And we estimate that there are a total, or we started with a total around 1,000.
Great. So Lee, tell us how you're using data to address blight in Cincinnati.
Sure. So we initially started with a private lot abatement program. It's our primary mechanism for abating blight. So really, there's 2 components to this. The first is issuing civil citations. So it's kind of going out and assessing properties. We have a team of roughly, the same number of people who are doing that work. We issue the citations, we determine whether there's a violation, and then we go back to the property, and if it's still abandoned, or if it's still in violation 10 days later, we term it abandoned. So abandoned is a term that we use essentially so that we're allowed to go onto the property. It's a legal term of art. So after that point, we have a whole list of properties that fall under our abandoned category, and they go into our abatement program. So our abatement program is actually a program that we have where we go on to the properties, we look at, we assess them, we clean them, and then that is added, that's put on as a lien to the property owner. So I think the way that we've used data to really revolutionize this is we posted that, this is a visualization to our open data dashboard portal. So if you go to our portal, we have a visualization that's called private lot abatement. I think it's in this deck somewhere. And it's essentially shows you the kind of abatements that we're doing, the neighborhoods, the properties. It's all interactive. It's updated every day. So you can see the streets where properties are abated. You can see neighborhoods. You can see which ones are frequent. And that we realized was kind of the key tool. So once we started looking at frequently abated properties, we were able to say, what do we do with this next? How do we sort of turn this property that we know is more or less abandoned, that we know isn't being maintained by the owner? What steps do we need to take to make this an asset to the community, and how do we pool our resources and target that property? So really our role has been pulling in all that data, making sure it's updated every day, making sure that in our citation database, as well as our addresses, that streets are spelled the same way, that kind of thing, and then making sure that people can filter, not just to see where blight is happening, but also so that we can start having conversations around productive use for these properties.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, one of the big challenges we had in New Orleans when I was in New Orleans is that the cities that have the most blight are also the ones that least likely to have the resources to do anything about it. So how do you use data to help prioritize the limited resources do you have, and how do you use data to get the most bang for the buck? Lee, let's start with you.
Sure. So I think, as you can see with our visualization, looking at this in and of itself helps us think through where is this happening. Once we know where things are happening, we can say, we know that these other things are happening in this neighborhood. For example, when we started our private lot abatement program, we realized that a lot of these neighborhoods where we had blight, we were also seeing other kinds of code enforcement violations. We were seeing zoning violations. We were seeing building inspection issues. So we were able to say, look, we know we have limited resources in this department that does private lot abatement, and then we have limited resources in code enforcement, and then we have limited resources in some of our neighborhood enhancement programs. What if we sort of pool those resources, knowing that there are a lot of things happening in the same places, and we think about how we can really target areas that need some kind of remediation. So for us, I think being able to see what's happening and where it's happening has helped us figure out how to target the resources that we do have and sort of improve quality of life in our communities.
Great. Yeah, Laura, what are your thoughts on that?
So I would say, with limited resources, and certainly Hartford we are very familiar with doing a lot with very little. If we could go back to the maps of the city of Hartford, I'd say there are two key things we're trying to do with data to be able to strategically invest resources. So number one, again, looking at the maps, I think it can be very tempting to want to go into zero in on sort of the worst of the worst. But instead, we used these maps, the first one last summer. We carved it up by neighborhood and again sat down with the community leaders in each neighborhood to kind of show them sort of where their neighborhood was in terms of the citywide problem and issue. But also looked at additional data such as crime data, fire data, but also asset mapping. So looking at areas of strength and recognizing, well, let's see, if our housing division is investing resources to house people on this block, and there's one blighted property, even if there's no other blighted property in the surrounding blocks, it makes sense to go ahead and invest those resources on getting that one blighted property done, and then that whole block is blight-free, as opposed to going to a street in sort of the worst of the worst where there's a concentration. If we get one property fixed and a family in that property, then they're living on a street looking at blighted properties, and they're not going to stay there long. We might see that property, return to vacancy and blight if they move away because they don't want to raise a family on a street with other blighted properties. I'd say the other key way that we have used data to invest the few resources we have strategically, and this is where the before and after photos come into play, is trying to identify sort of what is the lowest or minimum intervention strategy that we need to get owners to bring their properties into compliance. So our focus and goal is compliance first. And so we're looking at, and we don't necessarily have all of the resources we need at the city level to go in and remediate the blight, but where can we identify those property owners who want to do the right thing, but simply don't have the resources to do so, and we can connect them to partners that do, or simply need some education and training on property maintenance standards. And so if we scroll through the photos, we can see that in 2 instances, this is a house that was in the that is in the north end of Hartford, and this is what it looked like when I first moved to Hartford in October of 2016. If you, I think we've got another photo of the side, and then we've got a compilation of the work that's being done today on the house, and that work is being funded 100% by the property owner. No public subsidy is going into that renovation. The one thing that the city did is we sent a letter to the property owner saying, hey, we've got a new blight ordinance. According to our inspection on this date, you're in violation of these property maintenance standards. We'd like to see some work on the property and help you avoid fines. So we didn't impose any fines, but we also didn't pay for this renovation. And by simply sending a letter, which doesn't cost that much in the grand scheme of things, we rehabbed this one, or resulted in the rehab of this one property.
That's awesome. So, yeah, I mean, that's an amazing way to leverage private investment through an incredibly cheap intervention, which is
exactly
49 cents for a letter.
Yes.
So what, did you send the letter to everyone, or was that, or did data help inform how you used, who got the letter and who might have gotten the bulldozer?
So in instances where we do send a true letter saying, hey, we've done an inspection and we have observed these violations, we do send that letter to all owners of record. So there is title research that's being done in between that initial inspection and sending the letter. So it is a little bit more expensive than just the stamp of sending the letter.
Right, of course.
But again, going back to the maps, one of the things that we do, so in 2017, we identified 320 properties. That's what you see on the 2017 map. 320 properties with likely blighted conditions. We knew we didn't have the resources to do full title research and send notices to all owners of record and also all lien holders of record. In some instances, by sending a letter to a mortgage holder, that mortgage company can either get in touch with the owner, or they might have a property management service of their own that can go in and help clean up the property. But on the map, so these 320 properties, we knew we didn't have the resources to do that title research on all 320. So what we did do, recognizing that we wanted to be using these maps to have conversations with residents and community members, but being sensitive to the fact that every dot on this map is somebody's private property, we as a courtesy printed up just an informational flyer and posted it to the property. So that was, as our inspectors were doing their rounds, they went ahead and just posted a flyer to the property saying, hey, FYI, we have a new blight ordinance, we have a new blight remediation team, we see a couple of issues here, give us a call so we can resolve them. And that didn't cost a mailing or anything, and we hit all 320 properties with those flyers. And over the course of the year, I think we saw about 50 property owners come in and pull permits and get to work just as a result of that one flyer. Okay,
great. Both of you touched on how you're bringing different departments together to deal with this problem. I think that's a generalizable approach. I mean, in my experience, at least 80 to 90% of the public's frustration happens when the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand.
Yes.
So could you expand on that a bit more, maybe like how you're using data as the tip of the spear to foster cross-departmental cooperation?
No, absolutely. So the premise of our office, or the way that we have it set up, is we have within the city, we have a centralized enterprise data warehouse. So that was one of the first things that we stood up when I took over this position. And basically what that means is we pull in data from all over the city, so from all these different siloed departments. and we house it centrally. So that's to make sure that things like Main Street are spelled the same way in all of our data sets, which becomes really important when you're when you're looking at blight at 1560 Main Street and you want to see what else has happened at 1560 Main Street across the across the enterprise.
Right.
So we started noticing, that was sort of our initial move. We were able to see things like, where do we have vacant properties that are registered? We have a vacant property registration program for, it's basically people pay so that their vacant properties are sort of inspected by the city and they have to comply with certain sort of like facade standards, but they register with us. So not all vacant properties are sort of registered that way. So we were able to start looking at water shutoff data to see where we might have other like vacant homes or vacant lots that aren't necessarily covered by the registration program. We were also able to start digging into parcel data. So while we looked at things like tax delinquency to see where we were seeing, there was some like the correlation between tax delinquency and blight, we also started noticing really quickly that many of the blighted properties were owned by LLCs or by corporations or Incs. So we created a category for ownership that was basically, in the state of Ohio, if you're incorporated, you have to have LLC or Inc. in your, in the title of your company. So we started looking that up and we found that properties that are, or homes, or they're usually buildings that are owned by corporations, particularly LLCs, are like 36% more likely to have blight violations. So we were able to say, okay, we know that this is something that clearly correlates, whether it's, you have sort of like a slumlord situation or you have an out-of-town owner. Beyond that, we were able to see that a lot of these companies, when we looked back at the incorporation records, were really owned or incorporated by like the same people. So that's a matter of, it gets a little more technical as far as like piercing the corporate veil, but it did allow us to ultimately bundle a lot of our claims across departments, whether that's things like outstanding water bills with property liens, with inspection fees, with citations, to multiple properties that were really owned by the same person or the same company. So for us, it's been a really good way to remediate that, not just because we're able to collect money, but also because we're able to pool our resources and say, we're gonna make sure that our law department kind of knows what our buildings department is doing, which knows what our public services department is doing, knows what data we're collecting from water, who knows what, what's happening with this parcel data. So that's how we've been able to do that.
That is a fascinating example. So it's just from the text field you notice that like comma LLC or comma Inc. Like that character string correlated with this massive problem.
It's like 36%. So that was one of my analysts and I were looking at it. And we realized it also, we found, correlates with respiratory. We have child health care center data that's internal to us, and we noticed the correlation with things like respiratory issues, things like, sickness or frequent visits to like school-based healthcare centers. So we were able to see, wow, it looks like corporately owned, apartment buildings, particularly in specific areas, there seems to be some correlation with quality of life issues or blight issues that are given to the city.
And so just so I got that straight, so because of that insight, now who is doing what differently because of that insight?
So we're able to look at those properties and pull the records from them more quickly. So we look at them and say, we think that based on this factor, they're more likely to have, to have blight. So let's pull these records and see if they have this history of that. It's also really helped our law department bundle cases and sort of pursue things in litigation, which might sound like not a big deal, but it's a pretty important precedent to set, particularly for a city that is trying to like self-fund its blight program. We really rely on the collection from whether it's like citations or if there have been a lot of violations. It's not obviously the goal, but if we're going to continue doing this work, that's one of the ways that it self-funds. So it's made a big difference for not only our law department, but also a lot of our other departments, not just the way that they think about their information, but also the way that they work together and communicate information.
Great. That's a fantastic example. Laura.
Yes, so on interdepartmental collaboration, so I'm excited to deepen this effort in Hartford, but we've got a lot of great teams that work together from our DPW crews who we can dispatch to actually do some of the cleanup work while we're moving through an enforcement process, and our team of health inspectors that and our housing code enforcement inspectors that can look at safe and sanitary conditions and housing conditions. One of the things that we are looking to build upon and using data to help us build upon this is a group that we started meeting last fall, and it's modeled loosely after Blight stat in New Orleans. We call it Problem Properties Powwow, and right now it's our housing unit, our planning and zoning unit, and our blight remediation team to look at one of the problems that we see, and I think a lot of communities see, is that the word blight means something different depending on who's using it. And so when I use the word blight, I am thinking about vacant, unoccupied structures with serious property maintenance issues. But blight can also mean, in Hartford, it can refer to zoning, from the perspective of our residents and community members, someone who is operating an auto repair shop on a residential street. If you're living on that street, that is blight to you. And so, but that's something that is more effectively targeted by our planning and zoning team. So it's really important to bring those different teams and tools to the table, because it might all be considered blight, or different people might be using the word blight, but it's you might want to use a different method than simply blight enforcement. It might be zoning enforcement, it might be housing code enforcement. Great.
So to bring some of the concepts we heard from the previous talker, Tricia, how do you marry the data that you have with the human context of that from your residents, from the people who work on the ground, the inspectors who are out in the field every day? So how do you marry that thick data with the quantitative data that you have?
So I will say I loved the stories that Tricia told about people getting out of their office and going and talking to people. That's so important, and especially in this work. And it's one of the things that I am proudest of our team and sort of the culture that we've built, that candidly, it would have been very easy to put these maps together and, with sort of all of the training and expertise that we have on staff, identify starting points without ever leaving our offices. That's not what we did. Because that would be, as Tricia said, kind of an organization-centric approach. It would be kind of a data-driven approach, and it might be academically what makes sense looking at what you have on paper, but we know what we have on paper. We know the data set is not perfect, and so let's go and let's talk and work with the community members and the residents who are actually experiencing the challenges of these blighted vacant properties, and let's sit down and show them the data, show them the research, and we can make recommendations. But what is it that they would like to see for their community in their neighborhoods? And so we launched this program last summer called One Block, One NRZ. NRZ is a fancy acronym in Hartford for neighborhood associations, essentially. But So we sat down with the leaders in each neighborhood and showed them the data and talked about sort of what the goals we were looking to accomplish, and let's identify one starting point. And everybody interpreted the exercise a little differently. We had some neighborhoods that were really concerned about key commercial corridors that they wanted to see cleaned up. Some recognized that their neighborhood might be a gateway to the city of Hartford, and wanted to make sure the gateways to their own neighborhood were cleaned up and focused on that intersection. And then some looked also at schools and wanted safe routes to schools, but we couldn't have gotten that information without going and talking to the community, and it helps. The other thing that Tricia talked about that I've experienced in all of the cities that I've worked in is there really is a lack of trust on the ground between residents and their government officials, and communicating and talking with residents is just one of the key ways to help build that trust, and to say that we are here to work with you. You are the customer. You are the user. We're here for you and with you.
Great. Lee, what about you?
So one of the earliest things that we figured out when we launched this program was that we needed to think about equitable enforcement, and not necessarily meaning like equally enforce against everyone. So what we realized is what we were doing was somebody would make a complaint, say, oh, this is, we have 10 inches of grass, we need to, clean this. And we would go there, go to a home, post a citation, and then 10 days later come back. Some of these homes were occupied by older people. They were, held by people who really didn't have the resources to self-cure. So we kind of had to, we got called on that pretty quickly, and that was something that we sort of factored into then saying, well, how do we, is there a way that we can look at data, separate this and say, this is maybe a property that like we don't need to like go in and, start necessarily, even if we clean it, we don't need to kind of pursue it with the same enthusiasm as, say, like an LLC-owned apartment building that is sort of in shambles. I think also to your point, I really like what you said about zoning, because something that we've realized is that a lot of blight results from inappropriately zoned or inappropriately used land. I don't know if this is true in other cities, I imagine it is, but zoning and land use is really difficult to update as far as like the policies and how, at least for us, how properties and how areas are used. So I think that having conversations around, we have blight in this area because it's all manufacturing. Well, we don't really have manufacturing in the city as far as like an actual land use anymore. How do we need to rethink the ways that we're using this area? So it's things like that that you don't necessarily get by just looking at it. You can say, oh, I noticed that there is a lot of blight in a manufacturing area, but then if you go there, you notice like this is mostly residential, and a lot of these people probably don't have variances, so maybe, and there's still a lot of other blight and it's affecting their quality of life. We need to like actually have conversations and sort of engage people.
Excellent. All right, Lee, what are you working on next? Where do you see, what are the opportunities for the future of how data can help improve blight service delivery in Cincinnati?
Yeah, so I think for me at least, when I think about blight is sort of the first step as far as improving, or a first step as far as improving quality of life. I think that we have become good at like remediating or mitigating because we've made it into a specific program, but I would really like to see that morph into a tool that is sort of human focused. It focuses on what are the needs of this community, not just how are we mitigating blight, but how did this come here in the first place? Does this community want to be residential? Does it want to be, commercial? How do we need to sort of think about land use here? So for me, I think using blight as an opportunity to sort of proactively, not just proactively pursue what's going on in communities that is negative, but also think about how we can find opportunities to do things that are positive.
Great, great. Laura, what about you?
And I would say next for us is using data to tell the story and communicate with our residents and community members as to the work that's being done. We've had this program, the Blight Remediation Team, that Mayor Bronin created when he, in his first term, is really kind of a long time coming for Hartford. We have residents who have been living on streets or next door to burned out structures, vacant properties that have been that way for a decade or more, and we are making a difference. It is property by property, but if we're not targeting that property that is next door to you, as we heard in New Orleans so many times, it doesn't matter how many properties we're doing. That resident does not feel like we're doing anything about blight because they don't see anything changing at the house next door to them. But so to be able to use data to kind of say, we know we're coming, we're going to get there, this is where we are, this is where we're focused, and this is the work that we're doing, even if it doesn't necessarily feel that way with every single blighted property in the city.
Excellent. Well, that was really outstanding. Thank you very much for that really insightful conversation. Great.